Hi, everybody, to those joining. We're just going to give it a few minutes just to let people join and come in, and then we'll get started. So thank you for bearing with us. Hi again. Just for those who are joining at the moment, we're just giving it a couple more minutes just to make sure we've got as many people in the room as possible before we start. So yeah, bear with us a couple of minutes and we'll get started. Okay, I'm told I've still got a few people joining, so I'm going to give it 30 more seconds and then we'll get going. Okay, I think we'll get started then. So first of all, ahlan wa sahlan, welcome to the British Palestinian Committee's policy roundtable series entitled Green-lighting Genocide, Britain and the War on Palestine. For those of you who may not be familiar with the British Palestinian Committee, we're an independent organisation of British Palestinian analysts, academics, lawyers, human rights defenders and others focused primarily on policy advocacy and particularly ensuring that Palestinian voices are integral to public discourse and policy making here in the UK. This series of panel discussions aims to dissect and scrutinise the different dimensions of Britain's role in supporting Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. By convening experts, scholars, and policymakers, the series seeks to critically examine and discuss Britain's political, economic, and military complicity in the sustained emergency in Palestine, while advancing policy approaches that support the protection of the Palestinian people and the realization of their inalienable rights. Tonight's discussion takes place on Nakba Day, and the ongoing nature of the Nakba, as referenced in the title of this particular panel, has devastatingly never been clearer. Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic, refers originally to the massacre of thousands of indigenous Palestinians and the forced displacement and expulsion of approximately 750,000, then 2/3 of the population, during the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, many of whom significantly became refugees in Gaza. As we speak today, 3/4 of a century later, Israeli tanks are pushing deep into Rafah, targeting more than 1.5 million Palestinians currently in that area, many of whom have fled bombardment from other parts of Gaza and are being made refugees multiple times over. It's being reported that almost 450,000 people have been forced to flee in the past week alone. And the past 7 months has seen the massacre of more than 35,000 women, men, and children by Israeli forces, along with the mass displacement of an estimated 1.9 million. From that point to this, perhaps the only thing as consistent as the campaign of settler colonization and dispossession in Palestine has been Britain's role in facilitating and supporting that campaign. And yet, in mainstream political and media discourse here in the UK, these shocking parallels and continuities are barely referenced. In fact, attempts to contextualize, have been often met with immediate dismissal, and many of us will have seen television interviews and broadcast interviews over the past months where analysts have been cut off immediately whenever trying to contextualize what we're witnessing in Gaza. And with this, Britain's role has often been obscured or mischaracterized. So today on Nakba Day, we hope to offer something in the way of a corrective by bringing together leading international scholars of Palestinian history and politics to examine this hidden history, exploring the origins of the present-day atrocities in Gaza in Britain's colonial past, and drawing out some of the lessons for British policymakers today. With that, I am honoured to welcome a really fantastic panel for you this evening. Starting with Professor Avi Shlaim, who doesn't need much introduction. He's the Emeritus Fellow of St Anthony's College, University of Oxford, one of this country's most prominent historians and scholars of international relations of the modern Middle East, and a Fellow of the British Academy. Among his long list of publications are his Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, Israel and Palestine, Reappraisals, Revisions, Refutations, and most recently, Three Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, published in 2023. Next up, we have Professor Razzaq Takriti, who is Associate Professor of History and Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Arab Studies from Rice University in Texas. Professor Takriti is a leading historian of anti-colonialism, revolutions, intellectual and political currents, and state formation in the modern Arab world. He's the author of the award-winning Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, 1965 to 1976, a truly groundbreaking monograph first published by Oxford University Press in 2013. And for those who are interested in learning more about the modern history of the Arab world from a progressive perspective, I highly recommend Professor Takriti's incredible Thawra series of podcasts, which are being featured online on The Dig. And then last but certainly not least, we have Professor Chandni Desai, who is Assistant Professor in the Critical Studies Equity and Solidarity at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on cultures of resistance and revolution, third world internationalism and solidarity, and she's published widely on these themes. She hosts the Liberation Pedagogy podcast and most recently written about Israel's campaign of scholasticide in Palestine. She's currently working on her first book, Revolutionary Circuits of Liberation, The Radical Tradition of Palestinian Resistance Culture and Internationalism, a study of Palestinian resistance culture. I'm going to ask our panelists to begin by making initial interventions of up to 15 minutes each, and then we'll follow up with a few questions. Given the depth of this topic and the length of the history, as well as, we'll no doubt hear the accompanying depth of British complicity, and paired with the fact that we've only got until 6:30, We're unfortunately not going to have time for audience questions on this occasion, but I've no doubt that our speakers are going to provide us with many rich insights to take away. So with that, Professor Shlaim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was made in Britain. Britain created the conditions that made the Nakba possible. The Nakba was the climax of Zionist settler colonialism and its ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The Zionist movement and the State of Israel are settler colonial movements. They are propelled by the logic of settler colonialism, which is the elimination of the native. The elimination of the native is a precondition for expropriating the land and its natural resources. Noam Chomsky observed that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism, the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. The Palestinians for the last century have been at the receiving end of Zionist settler colonialism on one hand and Western imperialism on the other hand, first under Britain and then under the United States. The hallmark of both settler colonialism and imperialism is racism, ruthlessness, and disregard for law, justice, and morality. British support was crucial to the success of the Zionist movement, and British support went back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917. In 1917, when Britain pledged support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, the Jews were only 10% of the population, the Arabs were 90%, and the Jews owned 2% of the land. The declaration contained a caveat, which is that the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine would not prejudice the civil and religious rights of what was described as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. But the caveat was meaningless because a national home from the beginning was a euphemism for a Jewish state. And if Britain was going to turn Palestine into a Jewish state, there is no way that any rights of the Palestinians could be protected. So this was a classic colonial document, an act of colonial criminality. There is an Arabic saying that something that begins crooked remains crooked. And so it was with British policy in Palestine from 1917 until today. One of the worst things that Britain did was to insert the Balfour Declaration into the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. So the result was that what had been a British promise to the Zionists had become a binding international legal obligation. The Palestine mandate was unique. The other three mandates, the French mandate over Syria and Lebanon, and the British mandate over Iraq, under these three mandates, the role of the mandatory power was to prepare the local population for self-government. In the case of the Palestine mandate, the role of the mandatory power was to prepare Palestine for the Jews from wherever they were. In other words, to prepare Palestine not for self-government by its population, but for international Jewry. In 1936, an Arab revolt broke out in Palestine against Britain and its Zionist proteges. The Arab revolt was suppressed with the utmost brutality by the British Army in collaboration with the Haganah, the Zionist paramilitary force. Rashid Khalidi put forward the argument that Palestine was not lost, as is commonly believed, in the late 1940s, but rather that Palestine was lost in the late 1930s because of the decisive way in which Britain crushed the Palestinian community and the Palestinian military forces, paramilitary forces in Palestine. This argument is advanced by Rashid Khalidi in a book that I co-edited with Eugene Rogan under the title The War for Palestine, Rewriting the History of 1948, and I agree with Rashid's argument. In 1947, the UN voted for the partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Britain refused to enforce the partition plan. The reason it gave was that it could not enforce a solution that was not acceptable to both parties. But this was a phony argument because for the previous nearly 3 decades, Britain had been imposing a solution that was totally unacceptable to the Arabs. The real reason for Britain's abdication of responsibility for cutting and running was hostility towards the Palestinians. Haj Amin al-Husseini was a renegade in British eyes, and in British eyes, a Palestinian state was synonymous with a Husseini state. And therefore, British hostility towards the Palestinians and Palestinian statehood was a constant factor throughout 1947 to 1949. Behind the scenes, Britain worked to defeat the project of a Palestinian state. It did so by collaborating with its client, King Abdallah of Transjordan, and supporting his bid to grab the Arab part of Palestine, the West Bank, which his army captured and later annexed to his kingdom. So Britain actively helped to create the conditions which made possible the Nakba that unfolded. An unbroken thread of duplicity, mendacity, chicanery, and skullduggery connects British policy from the beginning of the mandate to the Nakba. No British government has ever apologized for the role that Britain has played in the loss of Palestine, in the betrayal of the Palestinians. The last 5 British prime ministers have been ardent supporters of Israel, and all of them were indifferent to Palestinian rights. In 2017, on the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, 13,000 people, myself included, signed a petition calling for Britain, the British government, to apologize for the Balfour Declaration. Theresa May was the Prime Minister, and she not only rejected with vehemence our petition, but she said that Britain was proud of the role it had played in enabling the Jewish people to reconstitute their national life in their ancestral homeland. The most absurd manifestation of this pro-Israeli bias was that of Liz Truss when she was running for election as the leader of the Tory party. Liz Truss floated the idea of moving the British embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And her rival in that campaign was Rishi Sunak, and he was open to that suggestion. This gives you an idea of the length and the opportunism of some of the last five British prime ministers. Currently, British foreign policy is completely unapologetic about the Nakba and unashamedly pro-Israeli. An official document, the 2030 roadmap for UK-Israel bilateral relations, deals with trade and cooperation in various fields, but it has three unusual features. It commits the British government to work against the referral of Israel to the International Criminal Court. It commits the British government to fight BDS, and also, thirdly, it commits the British government to work against a focus on Israel at the United Nations. British foreign policy on Israel-Palestine is incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. Britain officially supports the two-state solution to the conflict, but it only recognizes one party to the conflict, Israel, and it refuses to recognize the other party, Palestine. Britain advocates direct negotiations between the parties to resolve the conflict between them, and yet it's precisely the asymmetry of power between the two parties that makes a negotiated, a voluntary agreement between the two impossible, quite aside from the fact that the current Netanyahu government refuses to negotiate with the Palestinians. The current war in Gaza is the climax of Zionist settler colonialism, of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which has now degenerated, has gone a step further towards genocide. This war is not a war by Israel against Hamas. It's a war by Israel against the entire Palestinian people and the project of independence and statehood. Britain supports Israel in two principal ways. One is it helps Israel achieve or it helps Israel with diplomatic immunity. It does so by using the veto on the Security Council, and it has used it twice in order to feed resolutions for a ceasefire. It also is opposed, Britain is also opposed, as I've just said, to the referral of Israel and Israeli war crimes to the ICC. And there was a request by the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to pronounce on the legality of the occupation. Britain wrote a submission to the ICJ in which it said the court should not intervene because this is not an international issue. Israel-Palestine is a bilateral issue, and the two parties should be left to sort it out themselves, and an intervention by the ICJ would make it less likely, it would impede a settlement rather than assist it. The second way in which Britain supports Israel is by the supply of arms. I am running out of time, so I won't say very much on this subject, although it is crucial. Even now, when the war in Gaza is entering its 8th month, Britain refuses to pause arms supplies to Israel. And Britain denies that Israel has Israel has violated any international humanitarian law. This position of Britain today is remarkable because Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and yet Britain continues to support Israel all the way and to supply weapons of war. So to conclude, Britain is complicit in the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing displacement and dispossession of the Palestinians. Britain is complicit in Israeli war crimes, and worst of all, Britain is complicit in the crime of crimes, which is genocide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shlaim. That was a really excellent outline and so many important points raised that I'd like to come back to a little bit later on, if you'll allow me. In the meantime, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Takriti. Professor Takriti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Professor Shlaim, for such a powerful discussion of the historical background. I'm going to be elaborating further on the history. That's what I was invited to do, and I'm going to try to discuss the impact on the Palestinians of this policy while tying it to the settler colonial mentality that Professor Shlaim has so clearly and forcefully outlined. Now, it's important to note that from the beginning of the British occupation of Palestine, which took place in the context of the Great War, there was a suspicion on the part of the Palestinian population, and especially that part that was aware of discussions unfolding in Europe and that came to hear of the Balfour Declaration and its issuance, that there was an awareness of the danger that the Palestinian population was confronting. They were worried about the potential for the settler colonization of Palestine. And that's why they formed something that was called the Christian Muslim Committees, which established branches in different major cities in Palestine, and immediately went about trying to represent the interests of the population, both in the peace negotiations in Paris, but also through communicating with the power that came to dominate their land, Britain. The first of these petitions, which was drafted in late 1918 and was sent to the British, contested two major issues. The first was the claim that you can use historical events that either happened or were supposed to have happened in antiquity to dominate people in the present. And that was basically directed at the heart of the Zionist claim on Palestine. So they actually said, and I'm here translating from Arabic, they were like, if a people says that they want to go back to this land on the basis that it was theirs more than 20 centuries ago, should not the kingdom of Spain be returned to the Arabs? Or should we not even return the map of the entire world to what it was since the days of the flood and Noah's Ark? So this was something that they referred to. Another issue that they referred to, which was very important, is that they communicated the fact that this was an international crime that was potentially in the making, and they were urging this power that was now dominating them to not make it happen. So they said, and I'm quoting them here, are the civilized nations going to impose on us or issue a ruling on us to leave a homeland in which our ancestors' bones are buried? If that is the case, then let's start of thinking of finding a graveyard for us to be buried alive. And you might think that this is dramatic language, but imagine if you were in the position of Palestinians at the time. Imagine if somebody was coming to invade your country, claiming that they had ownership on it before. They wanted to settle or colonize it. And it was already now dominated by an imperial power that was the most powerful imperial power in the world. And it became clear to you that this imperial power is hell-bent on replacing you with another population. Now, the imperial power claimed otherwise, and its officials continue to claim otherwise. They call it perfidious Albion for a reason. Okay? Because it was saying, we're here to balance two communities together. We're here to listen to both sides. Here's one little problem. One side was actually not living in Palestine, it was living in Eastern Europe. But the British were saying, this side has a claim on Palestine, and we're gonna facilitate the entry and the translation of this claim into reality, even though this claim is based on religious texts that were authored thousands of years ago. And there are many other religious texts that have counterclaims to it. In fact, this was an argument that was made by the only member of the Jewish cabinet, the war cabinet in 1917, Edwin Montagu, who stated very clearly that, yes, there are multiple religious claims on Palestine. There's a Jewish one, there's a Christian one, there's a Muslim one. But that does not change the fact that there are people there already, regardless of these claims. These are spiritual, religious claims. They have nothing to do with the right to the land. Why do I mention this? Because, unfortunately, this textual approach to the world, even though it's utterly nonsensical, still is being used. It's used to de-indigenize the native and indigenize the settler. It's used to say that Palestinians who live in Gaza, who live in Jaffa, who live in Haifa, who live in Jerusalem, have no right to live there because there is another population that somehow believes in their texts that the land was granted to them by God. There's a problem with that logic. In any case, Palestinians made it clear that they reject this. But no matter how much they engaged in logic, they were confronting multiple problems. The most important problem was racism. And I actually, there is a debate on this in the historical scholarship. Some historians, especially Zionist ones, but also some Arab nationalist historians, are obsessed with the idea that this project is pursued to serve purely the geostrategic interests. I do not believe that was the case. When this project was created, there's very little discussion in the War Cabinet of what the documents that we have from the War Cabinet of geopolitics. They're actually discussing religion a lot. They're discussing civilizational arguments. They're talking about the status of native peoples. They're talking about the right to settler, colonize, and most importantly, they're talking about the Jewish question in Europe. So the calculations around this question are not merely geopolitical. There are cultural elements in this equation. and there is also an element of racism and settler colonial outlook that cannot be dismissed. And that continues to be the case to this very day. Nobody will convince me that there's a geopolitical logic to the Gaza genocide today. It is not good for Britain in this region, does not serve its interests in the Middle East. It is not good for the United States, does not serve its interests in the Middle East. To destroy the Palestinian people has never been something useful. In fact, it has always hampered imperial interests in this region. It has turned potential allies into total enemies. And here, by the way, I'm not advocating allyship with the imperial West. I'm just making a note. For those that know me, they know that I believe in complete freedom from this imperial system. And they would know that I believe that there is an imperial system in this region, but Palestine was not the core to it. The key areas upon which British dominance was focused were Egypt and Iraq. And Palestine was important as a connecting line for trade, for the export of oil, for calculations that had to do with the protection of Suez Canal, but that could have been done through direct British imperialism. It did not require establishing a settler colonial presence that would actually have independent decision-making away from Britain, and that would cause headaches for the empire in future years. In any case, what is interesting here also is that we have an internationally sanctioned settler colonialism, and that is what is unique to this issue. And that's what the Palestinian people were referring to in this document, in which they mentioned or referred to the idea of the so-called civilized nations. They were referring here to the Europe in concert, because the League of Nations, it was an organization that was going to be established right after the war, that was going to represent the interests of the Allies. That organization eventually played the key role in setting up the mandate, in setting up the rules of the game. And these were rules of the game that already prejudiced it against the Palestinian people. So this is an international settler colonial project. Every major European state of worth, every great power, decided to put its weight behind it. So we see this continuing. We see this happening again in that other fateful and very important episode in the history of Palestine, which is the Partition Resolution of 1947. The Partition Resolution of 1947 was just as criminal as the mandate on Palestine that was imposed after the Great War. So we have two major wars, World War I, World War II, and in the aftermath of each war, we had a formula imposed on Palestine that was an international formula, but that was geared towards, in the first instance, establishing a settler colonial presence there, and in the second instance, ensuring that that settler colonial presence gets sovereignty. So we have to view this in those terms. Now, once we see this in structural terms, we understand how odd this project is. Because this was a very belated settler colonialism. It was unusual for the League of Nations to come and say, we're going to set up a new settler colony. That's not what they did in other places. In other places, what they were doing was ensuring that the empires that were victorious in the war were going to get their imperial interests facilitated in those areas that had formerly belonged to their enemies, that they called occupied enemy territories. When it came to Palestine, it was the only instance in the Middle East, as Avi has mentioned, that involved setting up a settler colony. The next phase, because at the time the settler colony was set up without pure reference to statehood or explicit reference to statehood, it was set up under the banner of establishing a Jewish national homeland. When we get to the partition plan, we have an upgrading of the status of the project. And that's also done internationally. And it's done with explicit British intent. Some people might dispute this. but actions are more important than words. If you were to look at British words in 1947, when they put forth the future of Palestine, when they presented it to the United Nations, the words sound really great. I mean, I'll give you an example. Ernest Bevin was at the time running the foreign policy of the country. And he framed the issue in very clear terms to Parliament and to his cabinet. He said, and this is, you can find it, by the way, in the Hansard. It's easy to get. And then in 25th of February, 1947, okay, we have him saying that in his address to the British Parliament, that the mandate, and I'm quoting him here, contained contradictory promises. In the first place, it promised the Jews a national home. And in the second place, it declared that the rights and position of the Arabs must be protected. Therefore, it provided for what was virtually an invasion of the country by thousands of immigrants, and at the same time said that this was not to disturb the people in possession. End of quote. Okay. Now, a couple of lines later, you know, by the way, don't think he's an anti-colonialist. A couple of lines later, he says, quote, the Jews set about colonizing, and there is no doubt that in the sphere they have developed, they have carried out some very great experiments. End of quote. So, you know, he's impressed by elements of colonialism. Nevertheless, he was clear-sighted on the fact that there was no way of launching an invasion and carrying out colonizing of this sort without generating immense conflict with, quote, the people in possession. So, there is an admission on the part of British officials at the time that a great wrong is being done to the Palestinians and Palestinian Arabs. Yet, what do? Instead of doing the right thing, the thing they had committed to in the white paper of 1939, which was to facilitate for the establishment of Palestinian independence in 10 years, they do the exact opposite. They sent this to the UN, knowing full well that there was no way that the UN was going to allow for a united Palestine to remain. Not under the powers that were controlling it at the time. Not under the United States, and not even under the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union had its own calculations at the time that were anti-Palestinian as well. Okay, it was to change its stance in the 50s. But at this stage, it wanted a settler colonial state in Palestine. And it made that very clear. We can discuss the details of why it did it later on. But there was no doubt about it. They were some of the biggest advocates for the establishment of a settler colonial state. And here, by the way, I'm asking you to think about reframing the way you think of the partition resolution. This was not a partition. Think of it from a Palestinian perspective. This was about authorizing the establishment of a settler colonial state on a large part of Palestine, if not the entirety of it. This is the way it should be understood. 1947 so-called partition resolution is actually the 1947 UN resolution to create a settler colonial state. The only UN resolution in history in which the United Nations General Assembly voted to establish a settler colonial state. And the reason why it did that is that the UN at the time was dominated by European powers, North American powers, and the offshoots of European powers. There's settler colonial offshoots in Latin America. The vast majority of Asian states voted against this resolution. All the Middle Eastern states voted against it. The Balkan states also voted against it, even Greece. They were opposed to it. But it was the Western countries and their settler colonial offshoots that supported it, and for a variety of reasons. But racism can be detected in every speech that they made supporting this decision. And our people paid the price. They paid the price because no sooner had that resolution been made, within 3 days, the settler colonists were emboldened. And they went about doing what they've been planning to do all along, which is to get the Palestinians out of their villages. 530 Palestinian villages were destroyed over the course of the following months. And this process did not stop. It continued even after the armistice agreements began to be negotiated in February 1949, many months later. It continued even after the armistice agreement was signed. You know, villages like Isdud, which was a big town actually, in relative terms in those days, it had people still living in it after the Nakba. But they were bust in 1950, well after the armistice agreement. So the logic was always there, and it started very early on. And it was emboldened by this horrific international decision, so-called international decision, because actually it did not represent the Afro-Asian world. It did not represent the true free world, the world of colonized peoples. You know, this myth that the world of the imperial powers is the free world, it's the biggest misnomer I've ever heard of. It's the world of the enslavers. That's the world of the imperial powers. But the people who were the wretched of the earth, the people who were enslaved in this world, they always stood with Palestine. In any case, they did not have the power to stop what happened next. So over the next few months, we had this campaign continue. And it lasted for a very long time. This is why I call historians that some people respect, but that I don't rate at all. Some people still refer to Benny Morris, for example. You know, the problem with Benny Morris isn't that he said that the Nakba is unfinished business. That's, of course, a big problem. But the real issue is even earlier than that. His book is an ultimate example of Nakba denialism because it denies that there's an actual systematic and pre-planned process going on. And you will not convince me or anybody with half a brain that a campaign that starts in November 1947 and continues up till 1949 and involves destruction and expulsion from villages on a regular basis throughout does not have a planned dimension to it, is not underlined by an intentionality. It's like saying that what's happening in Gaza now is not planned. I don't need to see directives from Israeli officials, written directives, to know that they are planning the expulsion of the people. Because their actions, their level of coordination, the way they're carrying out their program, and their declarations involve this logic of expulsion on a huge scale. And that's why we see this Nakba happening. Today, it's the ongoing Nakba. It's a repetition of what happened in the first Nakba, which was actually the setting up of the mandate. I consider that to be the political Nakba. Then the second Nakba, which was the expulsion of our people, and the establishment of settler colonial sovereignty over 78% of our land. Okay, and then we end up with, of course, the loss of the rest of our territory in 1967. And then we end up with the current situation now, where it's not just about the settler colonial state dominating the territory. They want to finish the business of expelling the people and settling the territory and transferring more settlers into it. They're doing that in the West Bank in their own way, through the land grabs, through the extensive expansion of their settlements. But in Gaza, they've decided to go eliminationist now. Now, I'm going to end here on a British note because we've been asked to focus on Britain. None of this could still go on without British help, even now. This country, although it is an American poodle in many ways in international relations, and no offense to any British person here in this room, I'm sure you're all British, but you know, that's the way it's been acting for many years. But at the same time, it is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It is a major player in European and world politics. If it were to take a stance, it could do good in this world. However, instead, it chooses to supply weapons, as Avi has said. It's committed great crimes by supplying the capacity for Israel to produce nuclear weapons. The heavy water came from this country. In the 1950s, they played a key role in the nuclear program. Okay, so they've been arming them to the teeth for a long time. They've been facilitating settler colonialism for a long time. When we talk about a British apology, it's not really just about the past. It's about reversing the harm they're causing to us in the present. They are really harming our people. They are damaging our lives. They are destroying our livelihoods. And this is happening in the most patronizing and disgustingly colonial way possible. I cannot stand the way British officials speak down to Palestinians. I cannot stand them telling us about violence when they've had one of the most violent records in history. And when they're producing weapons, we don't produce weapons on this scale. We're a small country with a small population that was mostly a peasant population and mostly urban craftsmen and Bedouin who were going about their daily lives producing and engaging with their crafts. It's a small, beautiful Eastern Mediterranean country. It is not an imperialist, vicious power in world politics. That is Britain. And when they project on us and claim that we're violent, that we are haters, that we're the bad players here, that disgusts me. The only thing I'm heartened by, though, is that there is a movement in Britain. The people have always been very different than the governments. We see this in the demos. We see this in these beautiful student mobilizations. We see this in the work of all the people of conscience in this country, in this progressive tradition in this country that has always questioned and confronted imperialism. And I hope that one day there will be a translation of this will of the people and into reality. I hope that one day we will see something akin to what happened during the days of the anti-apartheid movement, when the forces of the people, the voices of the people, prevailed over the voices of the special interests and the narrow political establishment that dominates both British lives and Palestinian lives today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Takriti, for that really frank and sobering, very powerful and important intervention. I think actually ending there, you've actually helped us segue as well into our next speaker in terms of the mobilizations we're seeing and civil society and a number of other things that I know Professor Desai would like to get into. So I'll pass over to you if that's okay, and I'd love to hear from you.
Hi. So I want to begin by thanking the organizers for this important conversation and event. And it's really humbling, and it's such an honor to speak alongside Avi and Abed. And thank you both for providing this rich historical context. My remarks today segue a little bit towards the question that has been asked around speaking about the tradition of anti-colonial resistance in Palestine and linking that to struggles against the British Empire around the time of the 40s and 50s. And so I'm going to focus slightly on India as I do that. I would have loved to focus on more, but in the interest of 15 minutes, I'll keep it there. Mincision Akka from Akka Prison is a song that holds considerable significance for Palestinian resistance, past and present. The song memorializes the execution of 3 Palestinian men, Fouad Hijazi, Atta El-Zir, and Mohammed Jamjoom, by British authorities in the Akka prison in 1930. British colonial forces accused them of being accomplices in an attack on Jewish communities during the so-called 1929 riots in Jerusalem. For Palestinians, these men were considered martyrs of the al-Barak Revolution. On August 15th, 1929, at the El Barak Wall, western wall of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a demonstration was organized by Zionist groups, which was seen by Palestinians as an attempt of Jewish worshippers to assert Jewish control over the holy site in East Jerusalem. This ignited widespread clashes between the Arabs and Jews, and eventually between Arab demonstrators and the British Army in Jerusalem. The El Barak Revolution was a form of anti-colonial resistance against British imperial rule and Zionist immigration to mandatory Palestine, immigration that the British began to encourage after penning the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which gave a legal basis for Jewish immigration to Palestine and for them to make a national homeland in Palestine. The Jewish population increased from 10% in 1917 to 30% by 1947. In 1930, Hijazi, El-Zir, and Jamjoom were arrested, tried by a British military court, and were sentenced to hanging. Their public executions fueled further resentment among Palestinians against the British Empire and became a catalyst for Palestinian resistance against British imperial rule and Zionist settler colonial aspirations in Palestine. The executions of these three men remain significant in Palestinian collective memory and continues to be commemorated as part of the struggle for national liberation and preserving Palestinian national identity. 1 year after these executions at Akka prison, in British India, in 1931, three Indian revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev Thapar, and Sivaram Rajguru, were hanged in Lahore's central jail by the British that had colonized the Indian subcontinent. Bhagat Singh was a prominent Indian revolutionary and freedom fighter who played a significant role in the Indian independence movement against British rule during the early 20th century. Deeply influenced by the nationalist sentiment and political ideologies of the time, particularly socialism and communism, Bhagat Singh joined several revolutionary organizations, including the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. He participated in various acts of protest and violent sabotage against the British Empire. Following a blast at the Legislative Assembly in Delhi in 1929 that Bhagat Singh and his comrades carried out, they were arrested by British authorities and were accused for killing a colonial administrator. While in British prison, Bhagat Singh, along with his fellow revolutionaries, underwent a prolonged hunger strike to protest against the harsh treatment of political prisoners and the unfairness of their trial. Despite widespread public outcry, attempts to stop their execution by Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, and international attention, the three men were sentenced to death by hanging. The execution of these three men fueled popular discontent against the British Empire, and Bhagat Singh's martyrdom in particular galvanized the Indian independence movement and inspired generations to continue the struggle against British colonial and imperial rule, and contributed to the momentum towards India's eventual independence in 1947. Conjoining the story of Hijazi, El-Zir, Jamjoom, Singh, Thapar, and Rajguru, their executions by British colonial forces around the same period in the same manner by hanging in the Akka and Lahore prisons, and the significance of their martyrdom for both freedom struggles enables locating Palestinian resistance to British colonialism and Zionist settler colonial aspirations within a broader tradition of anti-colonial struggle against the British Empire. The broader tradition of anti-colonial resistance and struggle against British imperial rule across geographies, whether Palestine, India, or elsewhere, was multifaceted and evolved over time. But there are some key aspects and tactics of resistance that overlapped across freedom struggles, which includes revolts, armed struggles, civil disobedience, including marches, demonstrations, hunger strikes, boycotts, labor strikes, political resistance, international diplomacy, and cultural resistance. The traditions of anti-colonialism also influenced resistance practices and tactics. The Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 occurred during a period of rising Arab nationalism in the Middle East. Events such as the 1936 Iraqi Revolt and anti-colonial uprising against British rule and the rise of Arab nationalist movements in neighboring geographies inspired and influenced Palestinian Arabs to assert their rights and resist foreign control. The 1936-39 revolt in Palestine was a widespread uprising by Palestinian Arabs against British colonial and imperial rule and Jewish immigration into mandatory Palestine. The revolt was a response to several injustices, including land dispossession, economic hardship, political and political marginalization, as well as growing Arab resentment towards Zionist aspirations for settler colonization in Palestine through the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The revolt involved a combination of guerrilla warfare, strikes, protests, and acts of sabotage targeting British military installations, infrastructure, and Jewish settlements. The British authorities responded to the revolt with brutal force, deploying troops to suppress the uprising. In addition, as Avi has mentioned, Haganah forces had also participated in this. The British imposed martial law, conducted mass arrests, and employed tactics such as collective punishment and demolition of Arab homes. Despite British efforts to quell the revolt, it lasted for 3 years and had a profound impact on Palestinians. It highlighted the deep-seated grievances of the Arab population and demonstrated the limitations of British colonial authority. The revolt officially ended with the assurance of the White Paper of 1939, in which the British government promised to limit Jewish immigration and establish an independent Palestinian state within 10 years. However, as Abid has just mentioned, they violated this promise, leading to further disillusionment and anger as the UN 1947 partition plan came into being, creating a settler colonial state, followed by the Nakba, which enabled the Zionist project to usurp a lot of Palestinian land beyond that partition plan, ethnically cleansing and dispossessing over 800,000 Palestinians and destroying over 500 villages and cities and towns. During the Nakba, some Palestinians and Arab Fedayeen engaged in armed resistance against Zionist paramilitary groups and later the Israeli military after 1948. These efforts were aimed at defending Palestinian villages and communities from expulsion and preventing the establishment of the State of Israel from existing on Palestinian land. Anti-colonial resistance against the British Empire took place across various regions around the world, especially during the early 20th century. India was the epicenter of anti-colonial resistance against the British, which I'll speak to for just a couple of moments. The anti-colonial resistance to British rule in the Indian subcontinent can be traced back to the early colonial period. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sipahi Mutiny, was a significant uprising against British rule. Though it was ultimately repressed, it gave rise to some of the most important anti-colonial revolutionary leaders in the subcontinent, including women such as Rani Lakshmibai, known as Jhansi Ki Rani, and marked the beginning of organized resistance against British colonial rule, which was multifaceted and was a prolonged struggle that spanned over several decades and involved various individuals, organizations, and movements. The anti-colonial resistance in India was characterized by a diverse range of strategies and tactics. The combination of nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, armed resistance, political activism and negotiations, and mass mobilizations all contributed towards independence. Nationalist movements such as the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League played a crucial role in mobilizing people from diverse backgrounds and regions. Through mass meetings, rallies, and campaigns, nationalist leaders engaged people in the struggle for independence and raised awareness about colonial injustices. They also engaged in diplomatic efforts and international advocacy to garner support for India's self-determination on the global stage, sought alliances with other anti-colonial movements, and appealed to international principles of justice and self-determination. As they mobilized the masses, they adopted civil disobedience in acts of defiance against the British. The non-cooperation movement, initiated in 1920 to 22, led by Mahatma Gandhi, aimed to boycott British goods, institutions, and laws. It witnessed widespread participation from across India, demonstrating the strength of popular discontent against British colonial rule. The civil disobedience movement from 1930 to 34 included mass protests against the British's salt laws. Gandhi and his followers marched for 240 miles to protest the British monopoly on salt production and the imposition of salt taxes. The Salt March captured international attention and galvanized support for the independence movement. Boycotts of British goods aimed to weaken the British economy and administrative control in India and demonstrated Indian unity and resolve. Millions from various backgrounds, including peasants, workers, students, and intellectuals, participated in the movement. The British responded to the civil disobedience movement with repression, arrests, and crackdowns, and immense brutal violence. Thousands, including Gandhi, were arrested and imprisoned for their participation in these activities. The tactic of civil disobedience had a profound impact on anti-colonial and racial justice struggles in many parts of the world after they were tried and tested in India, particularly in the early 20th century, including the civil rights movement in the US, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and even more recently, the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement in Palestine. But civil disobedience was complemented with armed resistance to put pressure on the British administration and its military forces to quit India. It unified people across different regions, communities, and in a common cause against colonial rule, and awakened national consciousness, which showed the British that the colonized were not passive subjects, but were rather willing to fight for their freedom. Returning to Bhagat Singh, he was significant because he played a role in igniting the national consciousness of the people and took into consideration exploitation as a key feature of oppression, be it of the colonizers or the national elites. He recognized the plight of the peasants and understood that the agrarian economy in India, which was deeply entrenched in a system of feudalism and colonial oppression, where peasants faced economic exploitation, landlessness, and poverty, and therefore advocated for land reforms and the redistribution of land. His ideology and actions also reflected a strong sense of internationalism, particularly in his views on imperialism, socialism, and anti-colonial struggle. He believed that the struggle for India's independence was part of a broader global fight against colonialism and imperialism. He expressed solidarity with other colonized nations and movements fighting against imperialist powers and incorporated international socialist principles into the freedom movement. Palestine and the anti-colonial tradition of resistance would have resonated with Bhagat Singh and his principles of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, and he may have said more had he lived beyond the age of 24. While Singh never explicitly expressed solidarity with Palestine, Gandhi and Nehru communicated their solidarity with the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination more explicitly during the British Mandate period and after the Nakba, which also shaped India's Palestine policy. In a statement Gandhi made in November 1938, he states, I quote, "Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England belongs to the English or France to the French." This was sufficient to explain, justify, and rationalize non-relations that India would then have. Though the Indian government had to formally recognize Israel in 1950, they refused diplomatic relations. India also excluded Israel from the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung in 1955, as well as the non-aligned movement. It played an important role in the United Nations to push for the establishment of the institutions for the Palestinians. During the 1948, 1956, 1973, and 1982 acts of Israeli aggression against the Palestinians, India led the defense of Palestine in the United Nations and also played a key role in defining Zionism as a form of racism. While there's much to say on this subject, in the interest of time, I'll move on. But over the last 30 years, we've seen a shift after the 1990s in India and Israel's relations and the ways they have evolved and expanded, particularly in areas such as defense, agriculture, technology, and trade, and more recently in the alliance of the right-wing fascisms and ethno-nationalism, Zionism and Hindutva. While nationalist movements and their leaders laid the groundwork for the establishment of democratic institutions and self-government after their colonizers would leave, much of the British infrastructure and some of its colonial policies remain intact in India. These movements had and continue to have and continue to have internal contradictions and major shortcomings that has had major implications for the violence that we see in India today, the political and economic disparities and instability that we see across the region, which raises the question of what are some of the limits of the anti-colonial tradition. While flag independence was achieved from British colonial rule in many places around the world in Africa, Asia, and the Americas in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, Palestine was different because it became colonized by the Israeli settler state. Palestinians experienced the horrifying Nakba and were recolonized by the state of Israel. In the aftermath of the Nakba, anti-colonial resistance began to surge again. By the 1950s, Palestinian refugees, displaced and frustrated by their dispossession, organized themselves in guerrilla groups, began to mount cross-border operations into Israel from Syria, Egypt, and Jordan to resist the Israeli occupation, to resist Zionism and reclaim the Palestinian homeland. Gaza became a focal point for the Fedayeen activity in the early 1950s and laid the groundwork for future Palestinian resistance against the Israeli colonial occupation. A decade later, by the 1960s, the rise of the Palestinian Fedayeen movement and parties and the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization became a strong force of anti-colonial resistance for the liberation of Palestine and the return of Palestinian refugees to their homeland, which also produced a really vibrant tradition of anti-colonial revolutionary thought. Its influence surpassed all borders and states and manifested relations of internationalism and solidarity across the tricontinental with liberation movements, revolutionary struggles, and social movements. The anti-colonial tradition generated revolutionary thought and action across the world and contributed to an ethos of solidarity from the 1960s to the 80s, which I also can't get into here. After the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the revolution was liquidated by Israeli forces, and after Oslo, much of the radical tradition of struggle and solidarity also diminished in the way prior to the way that it existed in the 60s to the 80s. However, over the past 17 years, Israel's siege on Gaza, its brutal military assaults on the enclave, has raised consciousness around the world, including right now, as we witness a genocide that is being live streamed, in particular as we're watching the elimination of the native. Israel's egregious violence and the BDS movement, Israel's egregious violence and then the BDS movement's work has renewed transnational solidarities among people of conscience around the world with Palestine. And it is urgent now more than ever, as the Nakba 2.0 takes place and ethnic cleansing through genocide is being enacted, that more and more people galvanize to stop and end this genocidal war. We are witnessing, as people rise up, mass state repression, police brutality, arrests and incarceration of pro-Palestine supporters and demonstrators, especially in Western nation states. But despite the repression, people of conscience must do what one can to pressure their respective governments to ensure this genocide in Gaza stops, as now per the obligation to prevent genocide in the Genocide Convention outlined by the landmark ruling by the ICJ. And so to conclude, I just return to the Lahore jail again in the prison notebooks of Bhagat Singh for a reminder that the revolution is an inalienable right of mankind. Freedom is imperishable. It is an imperishable birthright for all. And so let the struggle continue. But we need masses in the streets and in other places to engage in all kinds of disruption to end this genocide. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Desai, for that really, really helpful setting of Palestine in its broad and in the broader context of anti-colonial resistance to British rule. I think India is obviously a fascinating case, but also the echoes from the past that you mentioned in terms of collective punishment and demolition of homes and things that the British government also carried out in Palestine in the 30s is, that we see today still. I might come back to you if that's okay, Professor Desai, because you just finished talking about some of those transnational solidarities today. And as we've seen over the past 7 months, a huge increase in the mobilization against this unfolding genocide, particularly amongst Black, Indigenous, colonized peoples. Whether we think of the huge demonstrations that several of you have referred to, or the student encampments on a civil society level, or as you just mentioned, cases like South Africa's and Nicaragua's at the ICJ around the Genocide Convention. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this, both in relation to kind of Palestine's place in the anti-colonial movement today, potentially also if you want to make comments about Britain's role and influence in the world and how that might be changing. If you're not there, sorry.
Sorry, it just took a second because it unmutes and mutes.
Sorry.
Okay. I mean, I think at this time, what we are seeing obviously is a mass uprising. Mass uprisings are taking place everywhere, and what is sad and unfortunate is that governments that are complicit in this genocide and are aiding and abetting it are continuing to support it despite what the masses are saying within their countries. I'm currently located in Canada, and you know, and I imagine the UK is very similar in this way. It has been complicit in sending weaponry to Israel. It is complicit in supporting it militarily, financially, and in diplomatically and in other mediums. And despite the sort of mass resurgence of people in the streets or unions that are, you know, trying to cut ties with the Histadrut or student movements that are rising up in solidarity through the encampments, on the one hand, you have this vibrance of solidarity and you have people making a lot of noise, but what you also see is nothing happening at the level of the state. And so on the one hand, while there is momentum that is building, on the other hand, you're also seeing the limits of international law, you're seeing the limits of democracy, and you're seeing the limits of people's support around Palestine and the way governments are taking it up. So in the context that I'm in, it's both on the one hand, you know, there are mass movements building and different kinds of formations coming together. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of disillusionment as people are realizing that these governments are not actually engaging in sanctions or two-way arms embargoes and actually standing with what their people are asking for. And so I guess I'll leave it at that, if I understood the question correctly.
Yes, thank you. That's really, really helpful. And actually, it's a good segue into another question that I have for you, Professor Shlaim, about talking about governments and how far government policy is from the will of the people in many ways. And you talked a little bit about some of the contradictions and the continuities, and I wonder if you're able to expand on that a little bit. Also, in terms of what we see in Britain, obviously we have an election coming up at some point. What we might see with a new government coming in if that were a Labour government, and just to sort of get a little bit more into dig into some of these policies and positions and contradictions that we're seeing play out today as a result of all of the history that's led up to this point.
The most striking feature of public responses to the genocide in Gaza is the ever-growing disconnect between governments and people. This is not a new phenomenon, but it's reached really new height. If you look at Britain, there is a complete disconnect between the consistently and absurdly pro-Israeli policies of the government, even today, and the position of the people. In recent years, we have seen mounting criticism and hostility towards Israel, and on the other hand, mass mobilization in support of the Palestinians. And there are many manifestations for that. The marches in London are one manifestation. The student encampments, including the one at Oxford, is another. In America, there is the same disconnect between the Biden administration and public opinion. And in Europe, it's the same. So I think that apartheid is not sustainable in the 21st century. Israel may enjoy more impunity and more complicity from the Western powers for some time, but not forever. And things are changing. The tectonic plates are shifting. One manifestation of that is the South African charge of genocide to the International Court of Justice. What we are witnessing is the global South rising up and saying to the West, we don't need any lectures from you. We don't want you to talk to us about morality. And the global South is solidly behind the Palestinians. And this is the trend of opinion globally. And this is why, while I'm not hopeful in the short term, I am hopeful in the long term that Israeli apartheid is going to end.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up on that one. And just what your thoughts on the opposition as well as the government positions today, and how both have responded to the genocide.
There is no distinction between the opposition and the government on Israel-Palestine. The government follows the United States, and what government ministers say just follows very closely the line of the United States. And under the management of Keir Starmer, the Labour government has shifted from a very principled position of support for Palestinian rights to a position of uncritical support for Zionism. And I believe that Starmer described himself as an unqualified or an unconditional Zionist. So the Labour Party, or the leader of the Labour Party, is no different to the government in his unqualified support for Israel is doing. And one very revealing moment was when Starmer was asked, when he spoke about Israel's right to defend itself, and he was asked, does that include the right to stop water and food from reaching Gaza? And he said, yes, Israel has the right to defend itself. So both Labour and the government are using cliches like Israel's right to defend itself. But even if Israel had this right, and that's debatable, it's the Palestinians who are under occupation who have the right to struggle for liberation, including armed struggle. But even if Israel had the right to defend itself, its response must be within the bounds of international humanitarian law. And Israel is violating international humanitarian law all the time, every day, but everything that he's doing. For example, the forcible displacement of civilians is a war crime, and Israel has been doing it non-stop for the last 7 months. The destruction of health centers and hospitals is a crime. Israel has been doing it systematically. Israel has also been carrying out cultural genocide in Gaza. And to me, it's very, very disturbing that when genocide is being live streamed and when Israeli leaders make no attempt to conceal the intention of genocide, the attitude of both the government and the labor opposition in this country is so pathetic, so disturbing, so unprincipled, and so immoral.
Thank you, Professor Shlaim. Yeah, there's not much to say about that. I think that's unfortunately absolutely right. I'd like to come to you, if that's okay now, Professor Takriti. You were talking in your intervention very powerfully about the role of Britain in facilitating settler colonialism in Palestine. And I wonder whether you could just maybe expand a little bit on the way that Britain's role has been characterized or perhaps mischaracterized within British historical media and political discourse to disguise British racism and complicity in Palestinian dispossession, and particularly since the start of this period of genocide.
Yeah, well, the British historical establishment has a problem. In fact, the whole Western historical establishment has a problem. History has been taught in very conservative ways when it comes to the questions of colonialism in general. But it is especially oppressive when it comes to the question of Palestine. And that has to do with many, many different factors, including epistemological problems in the field, but also including the political inclinations of those that hold positions of power within the historical establishment. Britain is a very hierarchical country when it comes to academia. And there is a great deal of gatekeeping that happens when it comes to the allocation of spots in academia. There are very few Palestinian historians in prominent positions. That's not because there's a lack of talent, but it's because there's a great deal of gatekeeping. The main chairs of British imperial history are run by people who tend to either favor the British Empire or who tend to pretend now that they're into decolonization agendas without being genuine anti-colonialists. And I'm saying it very openly, even though some people might take issue with me saying this about colleagues. But our profession is disgraceful. Okay, that's the first thing I should note. Secondly, what's worse than the academic historical scholarship, and there are exceptions. I mean, we have Avi here, there's a couple of people out there, but these are the lone voices. These are voices that have also had to, operate in an atmosphere where they were presented as being radical or presented as being, somehow alternative or not mainstream. Whereas the reality is what's radical but radically oppressive is actually what's published and what's talked about in these mainstream venues. And I know about this because I received my higher education in a British Imperial and Commonwealth program, a history program that it was very influential, but it's very conservative, the program in Oxford. And the main people that were teaching the Imperial history seminar were extremely conservative when it came to the whole world. And you just have to read the Oxford history of the British Empire to realize how horrendous the way of thinking around Britain and its imperial role globally is. Now, there's going to be change, and change is happening. Change started not from these centers of power. It started from different historians who came from a younger generation and who are rewriting histories of different parts of the world. When it comes to the academic record, we have new developments. We have spaces for articulating more progressive thoughts. But if you look at the pop histories, the books that are allowed to be published by the major big publishing houses, the books that receive circulation, okay, if you think about it, it's always the smaller publishers that are talking about Palestine in very radical ways. Avi may publish with Penguin when it comes to writing about Jordan, for example, but when it comes to Palestine, he has to publish with, in my opinion, a far more distinguished publisher than Penguin, which is Verso, but still, it's not a publisher that has the same reach, for example. And this is the same author, and he's a very well-known, internationally renowned author. If you look at somebody like Ilan Pape, a great historian by any measure, a historian that would sell also. He has an audience. So there's an interest in big publishers to be having somebody like him. It would be an honor for them. He has to go for wonderful, excellent, outstanding independent publishers, but it's not the ones that have the big platforms. And here I'm talking about Jewish Israeli historians. So can you imagine how bad it is for Palestinian historians? The lesson that we've been told throughout is don't talk about Palestine. And if you do talk about Palestine, talk about it in ways where you moderate your message or where you water it down or where you don't speak the full truth, because you will not get an avenue. You will lose jobs. You will not get opportunities. And many of us have lost jobs and have not received opportunities but we have no option but to continue. So the truth will come out, Sarah, eventually. Unfortunately, however, when it comes to Britain, it always comes out too late. You know, and this is what the British establishment is very skilled at. They'll talk about Kenya today and Mau Mau, like, yeah, let's talk about it like a million years later when it's no longer a hot topic in Britain, and where Britain could actually prevent violence, let alone like aid and abet it, which is what's happening in Gaza today. Same when it comes to South Africa. This country had a disgraceful record on South Africa, and people were writing terrible books on South Africa. You know, there were, of course, radical people that were doing better job. And, you know, somebody like C.L.R. James, his masterpiece, The Black Jacobins on Haiti, had to wait 25 years for it to appear, you know, after he actually wrote it. He wrote it in the 1930s, and, you know, it got circulation finally in the 60s. And, you know, later on you have Penguin Classics publishing it like 3 zillion years later when they want to pretend they're now suddenly interested in Black voices or lives. So I don't want this to happen to Palestine. We will do change. I think there is a determination on the part of the younger generation to do something. There is a change happening amongst academic historians. I'm more skeptical about pop histories. Far too many platforms are given to people who don't know anything about this part of the world and who publish big books on it. Simon Sebag Montefiore, who doesn't understand a single word of Arabic, his book sells on Jerusalem. And it's total utter garbage. You know, I say it as a historian. You know, people like that, why are they getting published? They have nothing to say, nothing to add to the conversation. They're colonialists, and they get celebrated, they're reviewed. This has to stop.
Thank you, Professor Takriti. And I wish we had another hour and a half actually to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we don't. But I think the point you just made there at the end about the gatekeeping is not just true of academia; it's true of all kinds of discourse and establishments and in you know, policymaking spheres in media. And I think it's part of the idea of having a series like this is to try and create some of those spaces where we can discuss things in a more truthful and honest way. So thank you is all I'm going to say for now for all of our distinguished speakers. You've been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everybody who's joined us online. I want to thank also SOAS and the International State Crimes Initiative who have co-sponsored this panel. And just to say the recording will be available afterwards. And a quick note to look out for our next panel discussion, which will take place in June. And the best way to keep informed on that is to go to our website and follow and sign up to our mailing list, which is at britpalcommittee.co.uk, or give us a follow on Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn. So once again, thank you so much, all of you, for your time, and good evening.